Welcome to Read Poems Every Day. We're going to wrap up our study of HD's poem Evening today. In a previous video, we covered the bean counting step in my study process. We listened for sound and sense, and we, of course, read the poem out loud. Something that I think we'll do right now, just to kind of remind ourselves of the poem, and then we'll go on to describe the poem's form and any figures or uses of figurative language that we see. So this is Evening by HD. The light passes from ridge to ridge, from flower to flower. The hepaticas, widespread under the light, grow faint. The petals reach inward, the blue tips bend toward the bluer heart, and the flowers are lost. The cornel buds are still white, but shadows dart from the cornel roots. Black creeps from root to root. Each leaf cuts another leaf on the grass. Shadow seeks shadow, then both leaf and leaf shadow are lost. Okay, form and figure. If you scroll past the poem and the indication of the source, you'll see that Poetry Foundation has some useful categories according to which we might study the poem or think about or interpret the poem. And the one that stands out as potentially important for grappling with it is this category Imagist that HD is associated with. I think you can probably surmise some of the reasons why this poem might be a good example of Imagism, but and I'm not going to lecture about Imagism since it's not actually something that I spend much time studying. But I think some features that stand out that are relevant for thinking about the poem's form are worth recording, whether or not we think of them as definitionally important to a certain kind of poetry writing that was happening in the early 20th century. How might we describe the poem's form? Short lines, bare descriptions. Bare might be the wrong word, though, because we still have pretty vivid descriptions throughout the poem. References to color, bare descriptions. Maybe we should say precise descriptions. Repetition favored over synonyms or dilations. By that I mean, the poem, we have the reference to cornel buds, cornel roots. Instead of finding other ways to refer to either the same object or parts of the same object, the poem, as I talked about under the sound and sense, leans into repetition. Why get rid of the word or look for an alternative word when you can just use the same one again to try to um, capture something? So what is trying to be captured? What is being captured? Captured. Maybe that's the wrong, somewhat aggressive verb. What is being captured? But I'll leave it there. Um, hmm. The poem is less interested in a dramatic situation than it is in, and I think I kind of I'm working toward that when I tried to sort of listen for the poem's prose sense. Less interested in a dramatic situation than it is in a moment or short duration of sensory perception. Those of you who might be a little familiar with visual art of this period or the decades sort of leading up to this poem, which is around I think is probably 1912 is when this poem was published. The decades leading up to that, you have movements in the visual arts like Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Cubism, abstract painting, And one idea motivating, potentially motivating some of the painters who are sometimes slotted into those movements is that they're less interested in capturing through kind of photographic realism the way that people or objects appear to the human eye in any given moment, but rather through different kinds of plays of color, brushstroke, obfuscation, um, that the painters are attempting to try to express or get the viewer to somehow feel something about a certain angle of perception or a moment of perception. I don't know if that makes sense, but I hope you see what I'm trying to say is that there's a connection maybe between the arts in this moment. And while this is not a painting, what HD is attempting through the written word, through verse lyric, um, through poetic verse, is to try to capture a kind of momentary perception or sensation of evening. Now, of course, it's not a general sense. It's tied to odd particulars, which we'll get to in just a moment. Okay, so but what I'm saying is the short lines, bare descriptions, precise descriptions, the favoring of repetition, uh, all of that I think is maybe kind of pointing us in a direction that I'm trying to articulate here. There's a link between those two things that has something to do with what we might call the poem's form. Okay, what else might we say? So you have sort of a singular vision the poem might be attempting to express, but you also have a potential double vision. Relation between the first and second stanzas suggests a kind of progression or an implicit state of thoughtfulness that's on the verge of responding to a double loss, right? The loss of the flowers in stanza one, and then the loss of leaf and leaf shadow in stanza two. Okay. So thinking about how the poem isn't just it isn't actually a single vision, but a kind of double vision or a juxtaposition of two senses of loss. But then it kind of leaves it up to the reader to try to suss out the significance of that. And that I think again is tied to the length of the lines, the bareness or precision of the descriptions, but also the repetition. Okay, maybe that's enough about form for now. What sort of figures of speech do we see, or twists and turns of language use that do we see that are uh, that the poet sort of that is available to the poet that the poet avails herself of to write the poem? I think in lines 2 to 3, you have that anaphora from ridge to ridge, from flower to flower. So that's again the preference for the repetition of the single word is then expressed through the preference for the anaphoric repetition of a similar line structure in lines 2 and 3. Um, you have a similar, you know, hmm, prepositional repetition as well. So from ridge to ridge, those lines begin with the preposition from. If we zoom out and don't just look for from, but look at other prepositions, we see how the poem also does that. From, so from, under, toward. So you have these from. So early on you have sort of repetition of lines beginning with prepositions, um, article repetition. So I'm kind of by repetition, I'm saying like the beginning of lines here. So you have lines that begin with the. By article, I mean the word the. I could also mean a or and, but a or an. But here I'm just thinking of the. So line 1, 4, 7, 8. So you have the anaphora and anaphora there too. 7 to 8 with the petals, the blue tips. You kind of have 10 as well if you think of the and there, and because it's the blue tips bend toward the bluer heart and the flowers are. So technically the second word of this line is also the. So maybe I won't put that there, but I think you see that even these two lines also sort of feed into that repetition of the. I'll put them in actually. 11. So we have quite several lines that begin with the again in the first sort of the first half of the poem. So what's going on in the second half then? Which so lines beginning with verbs then? I guess these aren't parts of speech, but I guess yeah, I mean verb is maybe. So we have all of that. So I mean these are most of the lines, but note lines 14 through 19 begin with different sorts of words. So we have a noun here, sort of identifying adjective, verb, noun, adverb, and then of course the conjunction and. So you have very different parts of speech then appearing in the last. So here, what I'm tracking here is a kind of purposeful repetition that's standing out as sort of self-consciously um, looking for the kinds of effects we might expect from anaphora, both the kind of visual effects, but then also the kind of what might we call it? The sort of ritualistic sense of repetition that uh, sort of produces the meditative vibe of the poem. What other figures do we see? Light passes from ridge to ridge, from flower to flower. I mean, I do think we see sort of the play of light and dark, um, the play of light and dark, right? Seems to seems to seems to structure um, the tension, the activity of the poem and its prose sense. But interestingly, the light and the dark are not explicitly connected in a symbolic register to anything. Usually, light and dark take on a significance when attached to other kinds of binary pairs, or when the process of a darkening or a lightening becomes analogized or allegorized as another kind of development. But we don't necessarily see that here. Although maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe the emphasis on lost, right? Emphasis on lost as the final word of stanza 1 and stanza 2 maybe does suggest some symbolic or metaphoric work, some implicit implicit symbolic or metaphorical meaning at play there, right? I mean, the poetry of loss and of grief and mourning is such a powerful tradition. It's hard not to think that a poem like this, although not explicitly about the actual loss of anything, anything, just the kind of the falling of evening. It's hard not to see how the poem is kind of in a way playing at being the sort of first step of what would usually then sort of sprawl out into being an extensive elegy of sorts. But we don't get there. We don't get there. We just are sort of on the precipice of it, or a potential opening out that then just closes when we're done reading the poem. Although I guess as readers, it's up to us to sense if this the states of mind the poem could elicit would be potentially useful or spiritually resonant with with us if we are ourselves needing some articulation or expression or release of loss. Anyway, okay. Other figures of speech, I don't necessarily think so. I mean, maybe animation of adjectives like black. Black is an adjective, but it's then sort of animated as a not apostrophized, not spoken to, but animated as a entity of sorts. And shadow as well. Although shadow is a noun, but it's maybe personified animation, sort of personification, but not really personification. Maybe the shadow's personified, but okay. All right. I might go back up here under sense and think about the plants. So the hepatica, um, let's go back up here. I do want to put in just a link. Oops. Oh, so I did look up on the University of Wisconsin-Madison horticulture site, Hepatica here, sort of part of the buttercup family, a native of the northern hemisphere. You see the kind of white flower here, and sort of a purplish flower there. Another purple here. So I'm going to add that link, oops, in here. And then the cornel was a little harder to track down. My very rudimentary Googling was not particularly helpful. Uh, but I think what's being described is something like the flowering dogwood, sort of the dogwood tree, which would make sense because it does seem, flowers being described in stanza one, whereas we get something that sounds more like a tree in stanza two. And there's a reference to buds here and being white, and so when I was looking for that, this is the image that I was seeing. So let's maybe add in that link there. So these are the kinds of plants the poem is thinking about, and they look pretty similar actually, at least from these basic images that. Uh, so that's pretty interesting. Okay, thought I would just add those there. Ideas and questions. Ideas and questions. Do I have any ideas or questions? That is itself a good question. Okay, so I think I was already filling in this section verbally, so maybe we just might jot down some quick notes about that. The poem seems as if it's playing at or toward elegy, and yet stops short of being about a loss more specific than the normal loss of day as evening falls, right? Um, the relevance of the kind of cut off symbolism of the poem might rest with what a reader brings to this to the poem's impression or the poem's impressionism, so to speak, right? Or imagism. Okay. I don't know why I'm putting parentheses there. It's a very academic sort of play with a play on words to do that kind of thing. I guess I don't know much about, say, the cultural history of these particular flowers. That could be another avenue to go down. So I might be looking ahead to context here. Um, Cultural history of the plants referenced, especially with respect to their regions. I think they're both North American plants, or North. The Hepatica it said was Northern Hemisphere, but certainly uh, also associated then or present here in North America. So that might be something to think about there as part of the context to look into. Um, I'm not sure, to be honest, at the moment anyway, that I have the poem itself doesn't ask questions. And at the moment I don't have any other ideas about it, but maybe as I work through contexts, something will come up. Okay, readers, of course, HD scholars, scholars of modernist poetry, modernist imagist poetry. Hmm. Maybe environmental scholars or those who engage with, say the cultural history of plants in literature or in painting or in, to be honest, whatever. That might be useful. Um, Scholarship that studies both visual and literary arts of the early 20th century, because I think the relevance of visual art and what's going on with visual art is probably really important to thinking about the context under which HD is working, especially in 1912 as she's publishing her early work. I think I've said in the past video, some of the contexts that matter to me as a reader kind of don't change. The people I want to talk to about the poem are the people who know more than me, right? And so those are the people I would want to look to and learn from and join in conversation with, were I to kind of move ahead and try to work up a kind of professional interpretation of the poem. Um, so sometimes the context sections kind of look the same for me, but they also are me attempting to acknowledge what I don't know, and maybe what I still need to know. Okay, so readers, self culture. To be honest, I'm not sure. I mean, the identification of the plant certainly locates the poem, marks it as at least being from the global north, if not sort of located in North America itself. But I don't really get a sense of identity here. Difficult for me to get a sense of identity here. Hmm. Sort of North Americanness. I don't know. I'd have to think more about that. have to think more about that, and maybe with engaging with HD scholars a bit more, that would help me think about the what kind of relevant cultural categories or categories of identity might come to matter for a reading of this poem. It's very possible, at least for me, that not many of them come to mind. What else? If you yourself know a lot about HD, and you're sort of very frustrated that something very obvious is happening with respect to sexual development, or some reference to um, significant kinds of experiences that tend to get coded in these ways, please share in the comments. Concepts, yeah. To be honest, I don't know. There's no like theoretical concepts that really come to mind here that aren't already just kind of associated with um, the figures that I was tracking. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would have to think about, terms of literary study associated with the particular category of poems or the kinds of modernism that's at play here. So reading up a bit on Imagism. I know this kind of maybe overlaps a bit with the readers, but here I'm talking about the specific kinds of terms and concepts that might organize uh, con- um, more developed work on this poem. So, so Imagism, repetition does seem important. Repetition is actually a pretty key theoretical concept in French theory, post-structuralism, but also in poetics and narratology, literary studies in general. Uh, just getting greeted by Lila. Hey, honey. You okay? You okay? All right, I'm almost done here. I'm almost done here. She's almost rubbing on my keyboard here. All right, hon. You want to be on camera? Let's see if the tail goes by. There it is. Oh, you couldn't quite see it. The camera got a little shy. Oh, there she is. Okay. I think I'm probably ready to wrap up here. Concepts, imagism, repetition. There might be other concepts that emerge when I start. When I would, if I did, start to read more about sort of the cultural history of the plants referenced, the particular usage of plants, of flowers, trees in poetry. Just to kind of, there might be certain terms that get brought up in order to help help us get a kind of handle on what to say about what the poem is up to. uh, of course. hmm, Probably HD's other work. I think with Images poems, it's also often difficult, or poems like this one, short poems. This was also the case with the haiku, like Jack Kerouac's haikus I was looking at about a week ago, that it's sometimes difficult to study them in isolation. It's much better to kind of read them in clusters. I think the same thing about, say, William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience, that sometimes reading a lot of them helps you kind of get a handle on the individual poems themselves. Okay. I think that's probably it. Imagism, repetition. I do think elegy is an important term, an important one here too. Thinking about, can a poem kind of be an elegy if it doesn't state explicitly what's been lost? My sense is it can't really, and yet I don't know. Right, looking again at the poem, I have no idea what I would notice. I mean, I would always be guessing about what my eye might be drawn to. when coming back to it, either after having done some of this homework or just after a year or two or 10, yeah, I don't exactly know what I might see again, but I trust that I would. All right. So that's it for HD. HD, let's post that, save it, so to speak. Well, thanks for spending time with HD's evening with me. And hey, let's read more poems tomorrow.